do we do spoiler alerts with books? I know we do them with movies.
Yeah, we probably should tell people spoiler alerts. Yeah, if you are not current on the what has been widely known among historians since 1990 about an event that took place in 1836, spoiler alert, stop this podcast, go buy the book and read it. We'll
Yeah,
wait.
for sure.
Yeah.
I'm almost interested about spoiler alerts with regard to history because, I mean,
Yeah.
if you study this stuff, you should know it already. Like everybody knows the Titanic sank, right? We don't need to give you the spoiler alert about that when the movie starts.
Yep.
But there
Yeah.
are some
It's
things in
like
here
being
that are,
unwilling to writing a review of Lincoln and trying not to talk about what happens at the end.
yeah, spoiler alert. That's too funny. So let's talk about the real foothold for most of this drama, which is the ideology and the hero worship that seems to be like a companion guide to the whole Alamo adventure. Uh, for those people that don't know what the Alamo was, give us the thumbnail sketch. How do you explain it to an 18-year-old that doesn't know what the Alamo is?
Well, in the middle of of what is now San Antonio, once stood in the middle of nowhere. It was a Spanish mission, which is basically a sort of a churchy fort. We were the outer reaches of the Spanish Empire, and over the years, it became a secular fort, and then it became a military outpost for Mexico. The white settlers in Texas and the Tejanos got in a squabble with Mexico, and there was a revolution. The white settlers teamed up with some Tejanos, and they took it over, and they occupied the Alamo as a fort when the Army of Mexico came back in to take Texas back. The legend is that these white settlers from Tennessee, including Davy Crockett in Mississippi, that they knew that they were going to die. They faced overwhelming odds, but they held out as long as they could to buy Sam Houston time to raise an army to defeat Santa Anna and win Texas for the cause of freedom and against tyranny.
Pretty succinct.
Yes. Almost none of that is true.
A 13-day siege.
Right.
About a little shy of 200 people died at the Alamo.
There's let's say about 200. No one's really quite sure.
Defending the Alamo.
Defending
and then
the
a bunch
Alamo.
of people that we don't talk about died outside the Alamo.
Multiples of those people died, and sadly, mostly due to friendly fire, because they're very badly trained and armed troops, but there were just so many of them that eventually they got over the walls.
Shy of 2,000, correct?
Yeah.
So that's another thing I think that lent some cachet to this, unbeatable odds and this kind of thing. But as I'm reading the book, Forget the Alamo, I'm thinking about, which, by the way, for those of you who don't know, is the antithesis of the battle cry that Sam Houston made famous when he revenged, or how would you say it?
Avenged.
Thank you. And eventually won the independence for Texas, correct?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so they weren't supposed to even occupy the Alamo. Sam Houston ordered Jim Bowie to go there and raise the fort so that we wouldn't be fighting over it. You don't defend a fort that way. It's not like in Lord of the Rings when you defend a castle. And it was far too big to defend with 200 men. But William Travis was a romantic fool. He's this 25-year-old who was finally given command. And he thought he could convince through correspondence Sam Houston to send the Texas Army to go defend it. That would have been suicide for everyone. They tried to give up and tried to surrender on the first day of the siege, but Santa Anna said, "No, I'm going to kill you," because technically they were pirates. This wasn't a war. This was piracy. They were trying to take land away from Mexico and secede. And then the day before the siege, before the end of the siege, they tried to surrender again. They were not willingly giving their lives up. They just wanted to give up.
Yeah.
So when everything went to hell and all of the white soldiers were killed, this was a disaster. It caused panic among all the Texians, which is what the white settlers called themselves. And Sam Houston had to come up with a story about how this horrible military blunder shouldn't panic them. And so he started creating the revenge myth that exists to this day. They all knew that if they fought, that they had to fight and beat Santa Anna, or they were going to be killed and burned, just like their friends at the Alamo. And so remember, the Alamo began as a revenge myth where they had to kill the Mexicans or they would be killed.
Yeah. This reminds me a lot of the Custer's Last Stand, minus the revenge. There was no real other shoe to drop eventually with the Native Americans and so on. But Custer, terribly outmanned, warned that this was going to be a problem. People actually refused to come to Custer's help. I think this was the situation at the Alamo as well. There were people that watching this thing and saying, no, we're not going to go in. It'll just be worse. But as I'm reading the book, I'm thinking to myself, Jason, about, the kinds of things that we expect from our heroes. The word whole, you're a writer, you probably know this. The word whole, when it originally was conceived, was about perfection, flawlessness, right? To be whole. And when we think about our heroes today, we want them to be flawless. We want them to be whole. We want them to be without sin.
Yes.
And yet the triumvirate, as they're kind of referred to in the book, they're like the most sinful guys ever. Bowie was a slave trader and a shyster. Travis was took advantage of women, apparently, and two of the three were failed politicians.
Right. Yeah, and I don't think it's an accident that we picked three to worship. There are more interesting people there. There's Juan Seguin, who really was the hero of the Alamo and the whole Texas Revolution. But it's no accident that we worship a Trinity. This is, after all, a bit of a Christ-like metaphor, myth.
Interesting.
These men knowingly gave their lives over to help so that others may live. Yeah. And now we talk about their sacrifice. Yeah, and this is a Christ-like myth.
Yeah,
and which is why criticizing them is considered heresy here. I think you're onto something exactly right about how we give them we confer upon them perfection because we decide they're heroes.
And then when we hear that they're not, this is when everybody gets upset. Revisionists are called. They become the ones that are creating the fantasy, right? The revisionists. It didn't happen that way, or you're trying to make it something that it wasn't.
Yeah.